Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to a complete and detailed Chiori guide. Chiori is the newest 5-star in version 4.5 of Genshin Impact, being a new Geo 5-star support who can assist you from off-field or even infuse her attacks with Geo if you want to use her that way. In today's video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about Chiori, her best builds, weapons, artifacts, teams, constellations, and much more. Before we begin though, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and also that I'm able to give you guys this detailed guide early as I got to play her a bit on a media server before she came out. And with all that out of the way, let's talk about Chiori. Alright, so starting things off, what does Chiori actually do? First of all, let's start with Chiori's elemental skill. This ability, after you press it, will cause Chiori to dash forward at an enemy, deal AoE geo damage, and then also summon a puppet named Tomoto, who will stay there for 17 seconds, dealing AoE geo damage all the time alongside your active character once every 3.6 seconds. Additionally, if there is a geo construct nearby, while your Tomoto is active, another one will be created with an independent duration that will allow you to have two of these dolls out at once. Also worth noting that you can hold your skill as well to aim it or even use it in the air, and you can also swap out your next character mid-air and plunge with them if that's something you want to do. Typically you're just pressing your skill though, but it is worth mentioning. It is also worth noting that through your passive talent, Chiori will also gain 20% geo damage bonus when a party member creates a geo construct. This naturally will give her more synergy with other geo characters, and it seems like her kit is designed around that, synergizing well with characters that have constructs like Zhongli, Albedo, Geo MC, Ningguang, or even Itto through Ushi, but also some other geo characters like Goro and Navia, but more on that in the team section. An additional interesting property about your skill though is that after you use it, you can either press your skill or do a normal attack to trigger a special effect. If you press your skill again, it will immediately switch to your next party member in your roster, the character that comes right after Chiori. So you might want to think about how you're ordering your characters when you build your team. And then as your active party member hits an enemy with a normal, charge, or plunge attack, your doll will execute a coordinated attack of AoE geo damage, an additional instance of damage that can be triggered twice up to once every 2 seconds. This additional geo damage is skill damage. It's actually your upward thrust attack, which means you'll get 2 of these on top of the initial one that you use if you use your skill and then press it again and then attack on your active party member. On the contrary, instead of using your skill again, you press your normal attack after using your skill. Chiori will gain geo infusion for 5 seconds, which can be nice if you want to spend more field time on her, making her normal attacks more usable. Additional info I wanted to mention is that first of all, your elemental skill will actually not snapshot, so any buffs like Bennett's attack buff or Goro's defense buff especially, well, as soon as they expire, they will no longer buff you. And because a lot of these buffs, like for example Goro's buff, will only apply to your active party member, shortly after you swap out of your Chiori, you will lose the huge amount of defense percent that your Goro will give you, for example, making your damage a lot lower. So it's important to understand that while these characters can still synergize well with each other, you lose out on a lot of value because your skill does not snapshot, meaning that you will be buffed when you're on your Chiori, your skill and your burst will deal more damage, but as soon as you swap out, you will lose out on them and your Tomoto won't deal as much damage, so that's worth keeping in mind. I do want to add though that some buffs will be for all your party members even if you're not on field, like Goro's C6 that can give you up to 40% crit damage, so there's still some synergy there, but it's just a bit of a shame that the ability does not snapshot all of your buffs when you cast it. Additionally, it's worth noting that your Tomoto doll will last for 17 seconds with a 16-second cooldown on your skill, meaning that it will have good uptime. It also will attack once every 3.6 seconds. Additionally, it is worth noting that while her normal attack scalings are pretty normal in the sense that they scale with attack, the rest of her kit, notably her skill and also her burst, which we're about to get into, scale both with attack percent and defense percent. With that in mind, the defense percent scaling is actually higher than the attack one, and she also does have a pretty high base defense, which means that while both attack percent and defense percent buffs and substats can be useful, defense percent having a higher scaling will typically be favored. A lot of the times when you have a split scaling, going for things like damage bonus, crit rate, and crit damage are oftentimes going to be the best way to maximize all of your damage, but more on that in the coming section when we talk about how to build and optimize your Chiori. Moving on, for Chiori's elemental burst, it's pretty straightforward. You just do AoE geo damage, slice around you, with the damage scaling on both your attack and defense, but once again, the defense percent scaling is a bit higher. Lastly, regarding your talent priority, you want to maximize your skill and then level your burst, and you can either ignore your normal attacks or level them if you choose to geo infuse them and spend some time on field with her, but for most people it's not that important and you can focus on your skill and then your burst. Now regarding Chiori's playstyle and how good she is, let's go through them one by one. First of all, I want to say that Chiori's playstyle is pretty straightforward. You'll be using her primarily for her skills damage that'll be there the whole time you're fighting, even from off field, doing geo damage consistently in a similar fashion to Albedo. You will use her burst whenever you have it without needing to focus on it. It's a nice source of bonus damage. Use your burst whenever you get it without needing to stack energy recharge or focus on it too much. Your main source of damage will be your skill, that's what you're building around, but your burst is also nice and a decent amount of damage. As far as her skill goes, I typically typically recommend using it twice, in the sense of pressing your skill and then pressing it again to swap it to your next party member and then deal additional instances of skill damage as your active party member attacks enemies. This is usually going to be more efficient than if you were to skill and then normal attack to give your Chiori Geo Infusion. This is because not only will Chiori's Geo attacks scale on her just standard normal attack scalings, which only scale with her attack, but it will also require field time, and it will typically be worse overall for your DPS than if you were to get additional instances of skill damage instead of normal attack damage off field without needing to be on your Chiori, and that will obviously scale with defense and your skill damage bonus, so typically being better overall. But if you want to use her on field for fun, you can. Typically though, she's very easy to play. You use your skill and your burst whenever you have it, and you don't have to think more than that. Chiori's main role will be an off-field Geo support alongside other Geo characters to battery them, give them energy, and also a good source of off-field damage, with Geo characters not necessarily being the most meta, but oftentimes having good synergy with one another, so every new strong Geo character will give more options to those Geo teams and therefore make them stronger. With that in mind, we will cover her team comps later in the video, but for now, understand that her main role and main synergies is alongside other Geo units, even though she can be used as a flexible support in a generic team. Also, I do want to mention somewhere in the video that typically when you're using Chiori, you are focused on your skill and you'll just use your burst whenever it's up, but when you do have it, you would typically want to use your burst first and then your skill, because if you press your skill twice in a row, which is what you should be doing, you use your E and then E again, it will swap you to your next party member, which means that you don't want to have to swap back to Chiori and use your burst, so just use it first and then use your skill twice and then proceed with your rotation. Do be mindful when creating your party of who's going after Chiori, make sure it makes sense in your rotation, but more on that in the team section. With that in mind, I want to compare her to Albedo briefly because I know a lot of people are going to be asking. Generally, Chiori is typically a decent to sizable upgrade to your Albedo, depending on what your team is. In fact, if you're running Geo constructs and you have 2 dolls out at once, she'll deal significantly more off-field damage than Albedo passively all the time. If you don't and only have 1 doll out, however, she will be more comparable to Albedo, but still usually an upgrade, still offering you more damage generally speaking. With that in mind, Albedo has the upside of being able to snapshot buffs, whereas Chiori can't, although it is also worth pointing out that Chiori's dolls are not constructs, meaning they can't randomly be destroyed like Albedo's flower can if misplaced. With that in mind, as just a Geo support, I wouldn't recommend feeling like you need to upgrade your Albedo to Chiori if you already have him, but you can use them together in some Geo teams and they can work well. Mono Geo teams that we'll cover later in the video can run both of them or one of them, and they do serve a very similar role of a skill damage dealing support from off field. Albedo can give you some EM, Chiori can deal a bit more damage on her burst that also scales with defense, whereas Albedo's doesn't, and they do serve a very similar role, so I want to at least make that clear. Both are pretty decent off-field Geo supports, but Chiori will typically be a bit better overall, especially when paired with other Geo characters. The EM buff that Albedo gives will still give him a niche if you're running double Geo with, for example, Shoutout, who can make use of the EM a lot, and while this isn't by any means Shoutout's best team, it's something I wanted to mention so that you Albedo players don't feel left out. It's something he can do, but typically Chiori will overall have more damage, especially when paired with another Geo user, especially with a Geo construct, than Albedo, just overall damage-wise from off-field. I do want to reiterate though that Albedo's construct being the main source of his damage being breakable if a boss enemy walks over it is really annoying, but you can aim it, so it's usually not the biggest problem. It's just the problem that he has and Chiori doesn't because her skill is not a construct. It doesn't have the longest range, enemies can still sort of walk away from it, but it is still definitely an upside. Also, I do want to mention that regarding the split scaling tag people slap onto Chiori, I want to mention that it's more of a dual scaling than a split scaling in the sense that both attack and defense can benefit her. Defense will typically be more optimal to build, and then going for damage bonus or crit will be even more beneficial as it will buff your entire kit. But the distinction I'm trying to make here is that for characters where all of your kits scale on 2 stats sort of together, it is a lot different than an instance where it truly is split, like if your skill scales with defense and your burst scales with attack, like is the case with Albedo. So I want to at least point out that for Chiori, it is more of a dual scaling, if you will, in the sense that it scales on both stats, but it's not like each part of her kit scales on something different. Because of this, and we'll see this in the build section, going for damage bonus and crit, and also defense percent with attack being a viable substat, are all going to be useful to increasing your Chiori's damage, and I don't think that her dual or split scaling is something that hurts here. Because of this, Chiori doesn't really offer anything new, but is a damage increase to existing characters like Albedo, and can also be ran alongside of him. In fact, I think she's a character designed for those Geo teams to be paired with a Geo carry or other Geo supports, and that is her role. For those reasons, I don't want to bait anyone to pull for her. She's not like that insane or anything, but it's pretty good if you like Geo and want to play a Geo team. Outside of that, she's an okay support, pretty strong, but definitely designed for a Geo carry. So pull for her if you like her, but but don't feel forced to, especially if Geo is not your cup of tea. Alright, now moving on, how do you actually want to build your Chiori? Well, I'm happy to say that it's actually very straightforward and pretty easy, very similar to Albedo in a lot of ways. In fact, there are two main sets that you can go for that are very similar in value. These sets are the Husk of Opulent Dreams and the Golden Troop 4 pieces. This is because Husk of Opulent Dreams will give you a lot of defense percent as well as some geo damage bonus. The 4 piece will give you a total of 54 defense percent and 24 geo damage bonus, which is a lot of stats that Chiori can make use of. This will buff the entirety of her kit, both her skill and burst that do scale both with defense and obviously geo damage. With that in mind, the Golden Troop set can actually give you more damage to your skill from off-field, giving you a total of 70% skill damage from off-field, or 45% if you're on-field, and up to 75% skill damage bonus is really just a lot. To compare the two though, generally Golden Troop will be slightly better than Husk because it gives you so much skill damage, and it will be the best set to maximize how much damage your skill is doing. With that in mind, there are situations when Husk can also be better, like notably if you need the defense percent and have a lot of damage buffers in your team, like for example Farina, or if you are bursting every rotation or choosing to play Chiori on field, as Husk will give you stats that'll benefit your entire kit, like notably your burst as well, whereas Golden Troop will just buff your skill and give you more bonuses from off field. While that is typically fine and your burst is the main source of your damage, so again, Golden Troop is typically slightly better. Husk has situations where it can be better, notably if you need the defense more than you need the damage bonus, for example with a character like Farina, or if you care about your burst and are using it every rotation. Generally though, they are very similar in strength, and so you should choose whichever one is easier for you to farm, or whichever one you have better substats on. If you don't have either, mix and matching 2 pieces is very viable. You can go sets such as 2-piece Golden Troop with 2 Husk or 2 Petra for some useful stats. Alright, now moving on, for the stats you want on Chiori, again, very straightforward. Generally, similarly to Albedo, you want to be building for crit and defense percent. Now, while attack percent is still a viable substat, and because your attack scalings aren't terrible, especially if you're running a high base attack weapon, it can be okay. Defense percent, crit rate, and crit damage will be giving you the most value though to maximize both your skill and burst damage. Regarding energy recharge, since your skill is the main part of your kit, especially if you can summon 2 of them, using your burst whenever you have it up is typically going to be what I recommend, and not focusing on energy recharge. Some teams will allow you to get your burst back often, others will get it slower and would require so much energy recharge that building that much, investing into ER to use your burst won't be as efficient as investing in offensive stats like crit rate and crit damage that will increase your overall damage much more than being able to use your burst a bit more often. Energy recharge is not a useless substat, it's okay, but it's not as important as building damage, so I don't recommend it. Generally though, I'd say focus on defense percent, crit rate, and crit damage to maximize your Chiori's value, and use your burst either every other rotation or just whenever you have it. Because of this, I recommend looking for crit rate, crit damage, and defense percent on all of your pieces. Attack percent isn't useless if you get it, but is worse than the other stats. Because of this, what you're looking for is defense percent on your sands, crit rate or crit damage on your circlet, and for your goblet, it actually can depend. Both geo damage bonus and defense percent can be viable, with geo damage bonus being the general recommendation. There are situations, however, where defense percent can be better, notably if you have too many sources of damage percent. This can happen if you're running the Golden Troop 4-piece that gives you up to 70% skill damage, as well as having potentially other sources of damage bonus like Chiori's signature weapon, or even a weapon like Harbinger of Dawn that gives a ton of crit, which we'll cover in the next section. When you have this much damage percent and not that many sources of defense percent in comparison, then going for a defense goblet can actually be better for you, and so both are very viable depending on your build and team comp. Generally, I recommend geo damage bonus, but both are similar, so you can pick based on your substats as well as weapon and team from either geo damage bonus or defense percent. And a defense percent circlet can also be viable, but typically I would recommend going for a defense percent goblet before a defense percent circlet. Now moving on, for Chiori's best weapons, there are a few options that are very accessible for every type of player. I want to start by saying that because she has a split scaling, going for weapons that give you damage percent, damage bonus, or crit rate, or crit damage will oftentimes be the most consistent way of increasing all of your sources of damage, and so a weapon that gives you either damage bonus or crit is typically recommended. With that in mind, there's also a really good defense percent weapon option that we will also cover. So with that in mind, what weapons you want on Chiori? Well, honestly, it's very straightforward, and there's quite a few good options, including some amazing free-to-play ones. First of all, your best in slot will obviously be your signature. The Uraku Misugiri will give Chiori a huge amount of stats, notably 88% crit damage, which is insane, as well as an effect that will buff your skill damage. In fact, you will gain normal attack damage, which isn't really relevant unless you plan on playing her from on field or have her C6, and 24% elemental skill damage, which is quite a bit. On top of that, these bonuses will be doubled when your active party member deals geo damage, giving you a total of 48% skill damage, as well as also increasing her defense by 20% with the second part of the effect. Overall, you get 88 crit damage, 48% skill damage, and 20% defense, on top of normal attack damage if that's relevant to you, making it a really strong stat stick. With that in mind, while it is her best option, there are some great alternatives and some really strong free-to-play choices if you don't want to pull for a limited weapon. First of all, the two go-to free-to-play options will be either Harbinger of Dawn or Cinnabar Spindle. Harbinger of Dawn will be your go-to if you can maintain above 90% HP on Chiori. This is typically easy for a character like Chiori or Albedo because they don't have to spend a lot of time on field. Your Chiori will just use her skill, her burst if it's active, and then swap out, and so staying high HP is usually very easy. Additionally, you might have crystallized shields or geo shields in general that will protect you from going lower, and as a support, especially if you have a healer on your team, you don't really have to worry too much about randomly taking damage. This sword is good because it has such high crit value, and because you have a split or dual scaling, getting a bunch of crit from your weapon is very nice. 28% crit rate and almost 47% crit damage is a lot of stats, even though the base attack is low, making it an amazing option for Chiori. Now, I do have to point out a few things. Obviously, this weapon won't work with someone like Farina, who will constantly drain your HP down, and while I would say most of Chiori's teams don't really use Farina, there are some that can, notably with Navia, or just any team you might be making, so be mindful of this. Harbinger of Dawn isn't always usable, but as long as you're staying above 90% HP, and if you're not using Farina with her, then this is a great option, usually your best in slot free-to-play option, but also better than basically every other 4-star. With that in mind, Cinnabar Spindle, and also a high refinement Wolfang, can situationally be better. First of all, regarding the Cinnabar Spindle, this is an old event weapon that gives you a lot of defense as well as skill damage based on your defense. Now, I know on one hand, a lot of people don't have this weapon, and if you don't, that's okay, but on the other hand, I know a lot of people who have this weapon don't have Albedo and want someone that can use it, and Chiori definitely can. It can be better than Harbinger of Dawn if you can't stay above 90% HP, notably with someone like Farina, or if you just need a lot of defense. Now, something you need to keep in mind though is that the reason why Harbinger of Dawn will typically be better, giving you more DPS overall, is because while Cinnabar Spindle is a lot of stats and one of your best 4-star options, there are a lot of situations where its effect won't buff that much of your damage. This is because the effect can only proc once every 1.5 seconds, and the buff will be cleared 0.1 seconds after your skill deals damage. Because of this, if you're summoning 2 dolls, right, you summon one, and then when there's a construct and a second one gets summoned, if the attacks are off synced and within 1.5 seconds of one another, you will only buff the first hit and not the next one. Now, to my understanding, if both of your hits hit at the same time, or if one hits and then the other one is delayed more than 1.5 seconds, for example, your first one will hit and then 1.5 or 1.6 seconds later, your second one hits and then it keeps cycling like that, then this weapon will buff all of your hits and have a huge amount of value. As it stands though, unless you can time this properly or find a rotation that works and makes Cinnabar Spindle better in that regard, when you are playing with another Geo character who has a Geo construct and you are summoning 2 dolls, not all of your damage will be buffed, which will make this damage comparatively worse than something like Harbinger of Dawn that will buff all of your damage. With that in mind, Cinnabar Spindle stats are really good, and if you are only running 1 doll, for example, you're playing Chiori with Navia, no Geo constructs in your team, then Cinnabar Spindle will be better when compared to other weapons because it will buff a higher percentage of your damage comparatively than if you were to have 2 dolls and one of them would be mostly unbuffed. Overall, Cinnabar is a great choice because it gives you a lot of defense, doesn't depend on your HP, and is generally just a good stat stick. It's comparable to Harbinger of Dawn, usually a bit worse with a construct, or either a bit better or about as good if you only have 1 doll out or are using Farina. As far as other weapons go, Wolfang is great to give you a lot of crit rate as well as skill and burst damage on its effect, but keep in mind that the second part of its effect can't be triggered from off field, so for the most part, it's just crit rate and skill and burst damage, but that's still a lot, and it also gets better with refinement, competitive to Harbinger of Dawn and Cinnabar Spindle, and potentially slightly better at high refinement. Also, 2 other options I wanted to mention that aren't quite as good, but worth mentioning, are Festering Desire for skill damage and skill crit rate, as well as energy recharge, although, as I said earlier, that's typically not as recommended as some other offensive stats, but still can be useful, and the Finale of the Deep as a craftable option if you can't keep your HP above 90 for Harbinger of Dawn and don't have any of the event weapons. Lastly, offensive 5-star options that give you crit are great. Pretty much all of them are very strong, with Jade Cutter usually being the best for the insane amount of crit rate and some attack. Every other offensive 5-star option is great though, and overall, Chiori really does have a lot of choices. With that in mind, I will put 2 weapon rankings on screen now to give you guys an idea of what to expect with different weapons, but this does depend on a lot of things. There's a lot of assumptions here depending on your team, the timing of your dolls hitting, if you have 1 or 2, your substats, weapons, rotations, and all of that, so only use this to get a general idea. I also want to re-emphasize that Cinnabar Spindle is a great option. It can just be better or worse depending on the situation. Same with Harbinger of Dawn, that's great overall as a 3-star accessible choice, with there being a lot of other options as well, like some 5 stars and her signature being the strongest. Alright, now moving on for Chiori's Constellations, constellations, how good are they? Well, Chiori's C1, as I mentioned a bit earlier in the video, is particularly interesting if you want to play her with another Geo character who doesn't have Geo constructs. This is essentially going to be for Navia. If you want to run Chiori in a Navia team, I don't think you need your C1. I don't want it to seem like you do. Chiori can still be a perfectly fine C0 5-star support, similar to Albedo in that team, but with Chiori C1, you will be able to get 2 dolls out at the same time without needing a Geo construct, as long as there's another Geo party member. Because of this constellation can be either really good or really useless, depending on the team. If you already have Geo constructs, then the additional doll won't do anything, as you can only have one additional one at the same time from either this constellation or a construct, and it will also give you the 20% Geo damage bonus that you normally would get from having a Geo construct just from this constellation. Additionally, just in general, you gain some AoE, 50% more AoE to your dolls, which is good, but generally this constellation is mostly for Chiori in constructless teams with another Geo character like Navia in particular. In those instances, a great C1, but outside of that, I wouldn't recommend it. The C1 can also be nice for Noelle teams as well, where similarly to Navia, you may not have a Geo constructs in your team, and it can be helpful. For your second constellation, this is a more generalistic one, where you will get more dolls by using your burst. In fact, after you use your burst for 10 seconds every 3 seconds, a new doll will summon, shoot an attack of Geo damage that has a pretty high scaling that is also considered elemental skill damage, and then it will leave and a new one will come in every 3 seconds, getting 3 in total and increasing your Chiori's personal damage by quite a bit. This will effectively give you an additional doll who will come in and do some damage after using your burst, making it more important than without this constellation. Because of this, your burst becomes a bit of a higher priority, and I would highly recommend using it whenever you get it. This is a pretty sizable DPS increase to your Chiori, depending on how often you are using your burst, generally being a great option and a good early stopping point, but not a needed one. Do keep in mind that since Chiori is a sub DPS, while increasing her personal damage is good, it oftentimes won't be the main source of damage in your team, so do keep that in mind. Overall, a pretty solid constellation though. Moving on, your C3 and 5 will increase your talent levels to your skill and burst respectively. For your C4, this is actually a good one that gives Chiori effectively a follow-up attack, which is pretty funny. After you trigger either follow-up effect of your passive talent, tailor-made, and you do a normal charge or plunge attack on your active character, a Kinu doll will be summoned, deal some damage, and then disappear, and you will get 3 of these up to once every second, and these Kinu dolls will have the same property as your second constellation, dealing a good amount of Geo skill damage. Lastly, for Chiori C6, this will effectively just make her more of a main DPS, give her a new playstyle, decreasing her skills cooldown by 12 seconds, effectively allowing you to use it every 4 seconds, infuse your attacks with Geo, and also increase your normal attack damage by giving it a large defense scaling, so again, making her a viable main DPS option at C6. Her damage will be a lot higher because it now scales with defense, and you can continuously infuse your attacks with Geo because of how low your skill cooldown will be. This will just enable a new playstyle and give her more personal damage. Overall, Chiori does have good constellations, but they aren't needed as a sub DPS, although C2 can be a good early stopping point if you want. Alright, now moving on, let's get into one of the most important sections, which is regarding Chiori's best teams and strongest synergies. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, while Chiori can be used as a generic off-field support at any team that has a flexible last slot, or paired along another Geo support like Albedo or Zhongli, generally she will be best paired alongside a Geo damage dealer in a Geo-focused team comp. This is either going to be the case in a mono Geo team, notably with Itto as the DPS, or alongside Navia. Also, before I get into too many details, I want to reiterate in this section that you should be mindful when building your team of who's right after your Chiori in the sort of team order. This is because after you press your skill twice, you will swap to your next party member, and so you want to make sure it makes sense in your rotation, switching to whichever support or DPS you want to use after your Chiori. I would recommend thinking about who's going next in your rotation, typically starting with your supports and the characters that have longer uptime on their abilities, and then moving into ones with shorter uptime to maximize the uptime of each ability, and then ending with your on-field DPS character like Navia, Itto, or whoever. To go into more detail, first of all, when paired with Arataki Itto, you will typically run Itto, Goro, Chiori, and then a flexible last slot. Itto will be your on-field DPS with Ushi counting as a construct, and Goro will be a strong off-field defense buffer. What's nice about Goro is not only will he give incredible amounts of defense to your Itto, which will buff his damage, but he'll also be able to buff Chiori's damage when she's on field, notably for her burst, and while her skill does not snapshot, which is unfortunate, if you do have Goro's constellations, he can prove to be a lot more useful, with notably his C4 making him a healer, and his C6 giving you crit damage to all of your Geo damage, affecting both Itto and Chiori. Chiori will act as a strong off-field damage dealer, as well as a battery generating Geo particles, and your entire team of different Geo characters will generate energy for one another, greatly lowering how much ER you would need on a character like Itto, for example. Lastly, for your last slot, this is a flexible option, usually an offensive one, or a healer if you need it. Bennett can do both heal and give you some attack. Even for these sort of mixed scaling characters, the amount of attack Bennett gives gives you is still relevant. On top of being a healer, you can run someone like Fischl, Yelan, or any strong off-field support that can give you off-field damage and also allow you to crystallize for some defensive utility. As far as Furina goes, it can be hard to heal enough unless you're running Noelle as your DPS instead of Itto, in which case you will have no problem in doing so, but generally, whenever you can run Furina and have enough healing to do it, then the damage buff she gives you is very strong. Usually for mono Geo teams though, you'll run 3 Geo characters. A lot of the times it's Itto, Goro, and then Chiori with a very flexible last slot. I do also want to mention that it is viable to run a full Geo team of 4 Geo characters, replacing your flex slot with someone like Albedo or Zhongli, and just running a pure Geo team. You have no reactions here, but it works as all the characters will mostly have synergy with one another. Moving on, for Navia teams, Navia and Chiori pair very well together, even though Chiori doesn't get a second doll without her first constellation. With that in mind, I don't want anyone to feel like they need Chiori C1 to work with Navia. Obviously, will be a big damage increase to your Chiori, as I mentioned earlier in the video, but even without it, she will perform similarly to Albedo without having a destructible construct, generating some energy and dealing damage from off-field, being a solid second Geo option. This gives you the Geo resonance and allows your Navia to run on less ER, and then the other 2 characters of your team are extremely flexible. It would be a very standard Navia team, for example, with someone like Fischl, Furina, Yelan, Xiangling, or any offensive option, and then the last slot typically being a healer, like Bennett for an insane amount of attack, or even someone like Shen Yun to not only allow your Navia to do the occasional Geo plunge, but also to be able to swirl the element of whatever off-field support you're running. For example, with Furina, you can increase her Hydro damage bonus with the Verdescent Venerer set, and also heal enough to keep up with Furina's HP drain. Bennett obviously works too, but you'd have to build him more healing if paired with Furina. Overall, Chiori and Navia synergize very well with each other. Even if you don't have a Geo construct there, she works as your second Geo option, and yeah, she will get better with C1, but it's not needed. Additionally, you can do a triple Geo team with Navia, which I usually don't recommend as much, but it can work here. Someone like Zhongli or Albedo can be slotted in. Zhongli, for example, will give you a strong shield as well as a Geo construct and some resistance shred. Teams like these can work, and you can also use your Chiori with other Geo characters, like notably Noelle, especially in Furina teams, or Ningguang, whose wall does count as a Geo construct. So Ningguang and Chiori do actually have some synergy with one another if you're someone who likes playing Ningguang, even though she obviously isn't as meta as someone like Navia. Other than that though, as I said, you can also use Chiori as a flexible slot in basically any team that has a flex slot and can use an off-field damage dealer. Obviously, Geo isn't the most important sort of supportive element, but it's some damage and energy and can also be used alongside another Geo character if you want the Geo resonance and to act as a battery for them. Personally though, I think she's a character sort of made or designed to be ran alongside other Geo characters, like notably Itto and Navia, but also having synergy with the others I mentioned, like Ningguang and Noelle. Alright, now we're gonna get into the showcase of my Chiori in different Geo teams. It's gonna be with Itto and Navia, 3 different teams, 2 Itto variations and 1 with Navia. And what I'm actually going to be doing is running my Chiori on 2 different builds, either Harbinger of Dawn or Cinnabar Spindle. Harbinger of Dawn in the Itto team and Cinnabar Spindle with Navia and Furina because I'm running Furina and so Harbinger doesn't work. Both great options, both free-to-play options that I will be using for this showcase. I am running the 4-piece Golden Troop with my circlet changing depending on if I'm on Harbinger or Cinnabar, but my ratio is this with the crit inflation that Harbinger of Dawn gives you, or quite a bit lower crit but more defense with Cinnabar Spindle. My Chiori is on level 9/6 talents, and do keep in mind that most of this will be Itto or Navia carrying, but Chiori does provide quite a bit of off-field damage, so I might as well include a showcase of these teams in action. And so I hope you enjoyed the guide, and I hope you'll enjoy this showcase. Let's go.
Some of this. Let's pull in. Everyone, oh!
I am the cutting edge of fashion.
Oh, you're coming through. Attaboy.
Silver send up. I am the cutting edge of fashion. Let's light it up. Teamwork is fellow force here, I guess. This one's got your name on it. A little lucky. I am the cutting edge of fashion.
Really? Oh, you're coming through.
Your coming was just begun. Scatter!
Pull in. Press the advantage. Can't catch me. It's showtime. Let's roll.
Not done yet. The adrenaline waves are so long.
Yeah. Ha!
And so yeah, overall Chiori is a pretty strong unit in the teams where she shines, with Geo characters, notably with a construct, just being a sort of upgrade to Albedo a lot of the times, more damage from off field, and being a pretty cool character who also is very easy to build. She's not game breaking, don't feel forced to get her, but for those of you who like her, there's definitely some uses, and I hope I did a good job at showing that in this video, as personally, I have been enjoying playing her with Itto especially, getting 2 dolls and doing some passive damage, even though, as you saw in the showcase, it's mostly a showcase of the DPS character, she's definitely still there to shine. Overall, I hope you enjoyed the guide. I hope it helped. And if there's anything I want to add, it will be in a pinned comment. So be sure to check that. Thanks so much for watching. Super excited for our Lakino next patch. So stay tuned for that and my guide on her as she's out. And with that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.